Good to see everyone. I'm going to introduce Juliana Spahr and David Buuck, but I just wanted to say right off the bat, they have books, copies of the book they're touring with right now, An Army of Lovers, for sale with them. So kind of find them if you would like to purchase one today. It's really such a privilege and an honor and a delight to welcome Juliana Spahr and David Buuck to Evergreen from the Bay Area. Their collaborative magical surrealist novel, An Army of Lovers, is a tale of the times whose title invokes the tender, thrilling final line of Rita Mae Brown's poem of queer liberation, Sappho's Reply. My voice rings down through thousands of years to coil around your body and give you strength. You who have wept in direct sunlight, who have hungered in invisible chains, tremble to the cadence of my legacy. An army of lovers shall not fail. That's the stanza from Rita Mae Brown. The line has gone down in history. The book it appeared in, The Hand That Cradles the Rock, was a bestseller, and thousands of readers did tremble to the cadence of Rita Mae Brown's legacy. To adopt this line for a book title, at once invoking Sappho's ancient authority and the living memory of the gay and lesbian liberation movement of the 70s, is to evoke a time when queer passion was tapped as a source of strength for enacting large-scale and revolutionary social change. The authors omit the last three words of the title, leaving us to fill them in: an army of lovers, ... Once we begun to read the book, however, we realized the elision of these last three words does more than invite our involvement in a cry of confident optimism: shall not fail, since one of the book's major themes is failure, or the sense of ineffectuality, beginning with the difficult collaboration of two poets, Coco and Demented Panda, who just can't seem to get going on their collaboration, which is connected to a larger despair about poetry and its political effectuality or ineffectuality. The omission of the last three words in the title, then, is retroactively equivocal, affirming the ongoing presence of armies of lovers, see them storming into the night on the book cover, while putting the fraught telos of the lovers' army into abeyance. Imagine Beckett's fail more, fail better, and the old chant, dare to struggle, dare to win, in the same song. By means of a series of stylistically and tonally various prose segments, the book centers emotionally then on the ebb and flow of what it calls struggle force: signature drone strikes, torture, ecological collapse, environmental illness, chronic fatigue syndrome. It's all connected. In a world of discontinuities and ruptures, militarized borders and dams, the only continuum that seems left is that between physical and social ill. No justice, no peace. Politics is psychosomatic disease. The politically alive Coco and Demented Panda leak. They bleed weirdness. They are bitten. Their wounds are open. Though these wounds are seemingly brought on by inauspicious fluid exchanges with contagious animal bodies, one voluntarily ingests medicinal industrial mammal glands because, quote, we are materialists who read horoscopes and poets who say chi. The other receives an involuntary tick bite as she is attending to virtual scenes of torture. Their various symptoms and viruses are rendered as side effects of late capital. The destruction of animal worlds come back to bite us. If the body is relentlessly symptomatic, neither lyric I nor fictional self is the focus here. An identity is provisional, a political category, ephemeral, a dream screen. For every name in history is iPad. Setting in character are diagrams of cultural, political, medical, and economic forces, spectacles, and pressures, traumatized by the ruination of commons near and far, by states, so that images of street festivals and music shows bleed into images of war. Part of what lends this book its vivid life is that it is collaboratively composed, polyvocal at every scale. David Buuck and Juliana Spahr, in writing this book together, participate in long lineages of poets collaborating as a way of befriending each other and as a way of collectivizing the too often solitary labor of composition. In my program, Narrative Strategies, we're taking inspiration from Juliana and David's collaboration and creating our own collaborative writings together, enacting and embodying the way in which writing is always relationship, always conversation. In writing, there is room for everyone, and collective writing is a way to perform and instantiate that. Juliana Spahr is a poet, critic, and editor. Her most recent book is the novel An Army of Lovers, written with David Buuck and published by City Lights. Her many other titles include Well Then, There Now, The Transformation, This Connection of Everyone with Lungs, Fuck You, Aloha, I Love You, and Everybody's Autonomy, Connected Reading and Collective Identity. With Jenna Osmond, Spahr edits the book series Chain Links, and with 19 other poets, she edits the collectively funded Sub Press. The editor of numerous critical anthologies, she teaches at Mills College. David Buuck is a writer and teacher who lives in Oakland and also teaches at Mills. He's the founder of BARGE, the Bay Area research group in Enviro-aesthetics, and co-founder and editor of Tripwire, a journal of poetics. The Shunt, a book of poetry about the Bush years, was published in 2009 by Palm Press and was named on several year-end top 10 lists at Attention Span. Site City, a collection of cross-genre prose works about the Bay Area, will be published by Future Poem in 2014. His site-specific multimedia art project, BARGE, was featured in Yerba Buena Center. Yeah, there's the introduction. Yerba Buena Center for the Arts of the Area, now biennial. Anyway, there's lots to learn and lots to know about these poets and lots of works of theirs to read, which you'll have seen in the announcement about this event. I think that feedback was sort of like, get off the stage. So let's clap for Juliana Spahr and David Buuck.
Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm David, not Juliana. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to read something new of my own, and then the first half of one of the pieces in the book, and then Juliana will read the second half and then end with something of her own. So this is a poem from a manuscript in progress, sort of ostensibly around Oakland. And this is called A Swarming, A Wolfing. Perhaps then we might yet have become scavengers of the unknown, liberating the contact zones where we find ourselves, lumpy and contestable aggregates, that sweaty and angered entanglement of overripe species beings, buzzing and dew-drunk in the counter-future, impure yet interdependent, exercising significant otherness in the shared scrum of biopolitical fleshwork and rearticulatory speech actions, forging new next nows in the microbial commons of our shared social breath. Went back to the plaza and all I got were these linked cuffs, but then what's the point of an authorized protest? It's like perfume, gas, but the glitter blocks got my back up against the forward heave, a free-for-all fire drill, so let's meme out and tear down the fences. The Occupy Poets Brigade emergency group text service is now operational. Text back, what happening? Poetry? Jay, not sure. Where? Jack, on foot? And by the ice cream truck. Can you bounce up and down so I can find you? Jay, Irene hit with canister. The page you were viewing was encrypted. But who defines each situation? Our finance committee versus their finance committee. WT, anyone see Derek? Aaron, NLG needs Justin's birthday. So I'm going downtown to attempt to get back my tent and Lindsay's paper cutter. Not because I care that much about stuff, but I'm interested in the logistics. As I am I, because the big state knows me. As we press up against the facts, such as they will have been, and from have been to will is the breach in functional time, where being in public space with nothing to do is something to work with. Instead of killing time, you're free to live it, in it. Can you bounce up and down so I can find those yous that ache forwards, those thrashing thresholders? Jack, Justin's 38, March 28th. Representation is nothing more than the extension of context into forms, testing content and leaking matter. My hope, then, is by the time this is scanned, its affective logics and self-administered prosthetics will have been rendered obsolete by the events to come. Whose fuck-ups? Our fuck-ups. Text blast system auto text. Welcome back to the system. And so it's go time in the illuminated copter lights, our bodies flung up and slam dancing in the aftergas, rhythmed against the chopper blades and holding down the intersections, not yet kettled by the so-called realism of the cynics, tweeting from the rapidly shrinking sidelines. You can smell the autonomy in the plaza, 1 part vinegar to 1 part Malox to 2 parts tactical action cannabis. You can't believe your stinging eyes. But there we are, our own audience, lashing lit and lit up by the fires we set to cast some shadows to creep back into. Landscapes of dissensus composted with the shit we've swallowed for too long, topsoil for the permanent autonomous zones that each of us sing signs because we are all sound, every bod's body a bullhorn, a long-range poetic device. So be heard and not scenery, for in the stages to come, we can only ever be that we will have found in 2 a.m. Definity, thriller mobs lurching, bouncing up and down, pushing, pressing on, up and against. So, the chapter we're going to read is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Poetry. I don't think it needs any setup. It's an experiment in realism. What we talk about when we talk about poetry. My friend Mel McGinnis was talking. Mel McGinnis is a poet. Sometimes that gives him the right. The 4 of us were sitting around his kitchen table drinking gin. Sunlight filled the kitchen from the big window behind the sink. There were Mel and me and his second wife, Teresa, Terry we called her, and my wife, Laura. We were all writers and we lived in the Bay Area then, but we were all from somewhere else. There was an ice bucket on the table. The gin and the tonic water kept going around, and somehow we got on the subject of poetry again. Mel thought real poetry had nothing to do with politics. He said he'd spent years union organizing before quitting to go to graduate school. He said he still looked back on those years in the union as the most important in his life. Terry said the man she lived with before she lived with Mel was a poet. And then Terry said he was really political and talked about poetry all the time. He would never stop talking about Zhukovsky's poem. He kept saying it was the greatest poem ever written. He would quote it when we were in bed. An impulse to action sings of resemblances, or whatever it was. Terry looked around the table. What do you do with a man like that? She was a bone-thin woman with a pretty face, dark eyes, and brown hair that hung down her back. She liked poetry, but she liked the poets more. She liked the parties. My God, don't be silly. That stuff he was quoting made you hot, and that was it. You know it, Mel said. I don't know what you'd call it, but I sure know you wouldn't call it political. It was poetry, that's all. Say what you wanted, but there was a politics, Terry said. It may sound crazy to you, but it's true just the same. People are different, Mel. Sure, sometimes this poet may have written crazy, okay, but he wrote political poetry, in his own way maybe, but he wrote it. There was politics there, Mel. Don't say there wasn't. Mel let out his breath. He held his glass and turned to Laura and me. The man kept quoting Marx. Marx, Mel said. He finished his drink and reached for the gin bottle. Terry's a romantic. Terry's of that, give me a bunch of lines about capitalism so I'll know it's serious school. Terry, don't look that way. Mel reached across the table and touched Terry's cheek with his fingers. He grinned at her. Now he wants to make up, Terry said. Make up what, Mel said. What is there to make up? I know what I know, that's all. How did we get started on this subject anyway, Terry said. She raised her glass and drank from it. Mel always has poetry on his mind, she said. Don't you, honey? She smiled, and I thought that was the last of it. I just wouldn't call Zhukovsky's uptight aesthetics political. That's what I'm saying, honey, Mel said. What about you guys, Mel said to Laura and me. Does it seem political to you? I'm the wrong person to ask, I said. I write fiction. I don't even know the man or his poetry. I've only heard his name. I wouldn't know. You'd have to know all the particulars. Mel said, the kind of poetry I'm talking about moves you. The kind of poetry I'm talking about, you don't try to talk about Marxism. Laura said, I don't know anything about Zhukovsky. I thought only boys read him. I touched the back of Laura's hand. She gave me a quick smile. I picked up Laura's hand. It was warm, the nails short, unpolished, practical. I encircled the broad wrist with my fingers and I held her. His work did have politics, Terry said. She clasped her arms with her hands, and it's meaningful to many people. They talk about it. They use it to talk with each other. That's a kind of politics. My God, Terry said. She waited a minute, then let go of her arms and picked up her glass. What people won't say to get a little action, Laura said. He's out of the action now, Mel said. Laura's right. No one reads him but a bunch of white guys in Buffalo or whatever. Mel handed me the saucer of limes. I took a section, squeezed it over my drink, and stirred the ice cubes with my fingers. But his work's still meaningful, Terry said. It isn't like his work stopped capitalism, but it still means something to people. It still moves them, she said. Terry shook her head. Poor Zukowski, nothing, Mel said. He wasn't political. Mel was 45 years old. He was tall and rangy with curly, soft hair. He looked like the poet professor that he was. But he was sober, his gestures, all his movements were very precise, very careful. He knew how to write, Mel. Grant me that, Terry said. That's all I'm asking. He didn't write the way you write. I'm not saying that, but he knew how to write. You can grant me that, can't you? What do you mean, he knew how to write, I said. Laura leaned forward with her glass. She put her elbows on the table and held her glass in both hands. She glanced from Mel to Terry and waited with a look of bewilderment on her open face, as if amazed that such things happened to people who you were friendly with. What do you mean he knew how to write, I said. I'll tell you what he did, Mel said. In one part of the book, A9, he took this form from this classical poet Cavalcanti, this canzone. He took it because this Jew-hating poet that he looked up to was obsessed with it. I'm serious. He was a child of Jewish immigrants. He grew up speaking Yiddish, and then he writes a poem in English using an old Italian form that this fascist poet that he looked up to had translated. Can you believe it? A guy like him? But he did. See, he was devoted to the tradition, to the form. And so he writes a double canzone with complicated rhymes and meters, but he makes this poem about labor and love, and he uses the words of Marx to write his poem. He takes Marx and some other writers and he collages the words all together in this complex way to fit the form. But the form doesn't make any regular sense. The language is all weird and stilted. He puns on the words pit, capitalism, and capitulation, little things like that. He uses political words, but that doesn't make it political. I still feel it when I read it, Terry said. But what does it mean, Laura said. What do you mean you can feel it? Laura is a writer, or might someday be a writer. We'd met in a professional capacity, in the classroom. Before we knew it, it was a courtship. She's 25, 15 years younger than I am. In addition to being in love, we like each other and enjoy one another's company. She's easy to be with. What does it mean, Laura asked again. Mel said, he wanted to say something about labor and about love. The poem is about how, if things could speak, they'd have the voices of the people who made them, not just those who own them, you know, like this table here, Marx, all that. But that's the first canzone. 10 years later, after he's married and he has a kid, he writes a second part, and it's about love. So the love rewrites the labor part, Laura said? Some say that, Terry said, but I think they're together in this poem, that love is labor. He was abstract, Mel said. The music's there, but the meaning, it's all jumbled. If you call that political, you can have it. Oh, it's political, Terry said. Sure, it's abstract in most people's eyes, but he felt he needed to write it like that. I sure as hell wouldn't call it political, Mel said. I mean, it's clever, it's poetic, but no one knows what he did it for. I've seen a lot of poems, and I couldn't say anyone ever knew what they did it for. Mel put his hands behind his neck and tilted his chair back. I'm not interested in that kind of politics, he said. If that's political, you can keep it. Terry said, in the poem, love is part of the resistance to capitalism. It's about labor as well as love. Labor gets defined by love, a love that is care and attention to the processes of work. Terry drank from her glass. She said, but Mel's right, the poem's abstract. It's very formal, but also political. It's about politics, and yet its language is hard to follow. The form pushes away meaning. That pushing away is part of the meaning, maybe. But also in the second half, when the love comes in stronger after he gets married, it's where he gets all domestic, like us here, out of the union hall and here at the kitchen table. Isn't that a laugh? Terry said. She poured the last of her gin in her glass and wagged the bottle. Mel got up from the table and went to the cupboard. He took down another bottle. Well, Nick and I know what good writing is, Laura said. For us, I mean, Laura said. She bumped my knee with her knee. You're supposed to say something now, Laura said, and turned her smile on me. For an answer, I took Laura's hand and raised it to my lips. I made a big production out of kissing her hand. Everyone was amused. We're lucky, I said. You guys, Terry said, stop that now. You're making me sick. You're still on a honeymoon, for God's sake. You're still gaga for crying out loud. Just wait. How long have you been together? How long has it been? A year? Longer than a year? Going on a year and a half, Laura said, flushed and smiling. Oh, now, Terry said, wait a while. She held her drink and gazed at Laura. I'm only kidding, she said. Mel opened the gin and went around the table with the bottles. Here, you guys, let's have a toast. I want to propose a toast to poetry, to true poetry, Mel said. We touched glasses. To poetry, true poetry, we said. Outside in the backyard, one of the dogs began to bark. The leaves of the aspen that leaned past the window tickled against the glass. The afternoon sunlight was like a presence in the room, the spacious light of ease and generosity. We could have been anywhere, somewhere enchanted. We raised our glasses again and grinned at each other like children who had agreed on something forbidden. I'll tell you about politics and poetry, Mel said. I mean, I'll give you a good example, and then you can draw your own conclusions. He poured more gin into his glass. He added an ice cube and a sliver of lime. We waited and sipped our drinks. Laura and I touched knees again. I put a hand on her warm thigh and left it there. What do any of us really know about poetry, Mel said. It seems to me we're just beginners at poetry. We say we write and we do. I don't doubt it. I've read Nick and Nick's read me. But what do we know about the kind of poetry I'm talking about now? The stuff we all read and call avant-garde. Sometimes I have a hard time accounting for the fact that I love the more traditional stuff too. But I did. I know I did. He thought about it and then he went on. There was this time when I thought I loved that Mary Oliver poem about the geese more than life itself. You know, that one with the line about how you only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves? But now I find that corny, I really do. How do you explain that? What happened to that love? What happened to it is what I'd like to know. I wish someone would tell me. Then there's Zukofsky. Okay, we're back to him. He loves his wife and his son so much that he ends up writing a poem about that love, and then Terry's boyfriend quotes it to her in bed. Mel stopped talking and swallowed from his glass. That's the issue. Who would you rather read to bed to? Who would you read in bed to each other? That's the real issue. I used to know this woman, and we would read Ernesto Cardenal in bed at night. For an entire year, we read a few pages each night from Cardenal. Not because he did fancy things with Marx or counted his syllables just so, but because that guy believed in the world. Am I wrong? Am I off base? Because I want you to set me straight if you think I'm wrong. I want to know. I mean, I don't know anything, and I'm the first one to admit it. Mel, for God's sake, Terry said. She reached out and took hold of his wrist. Are you getting drunk? Honey, are you drunk? Honey, I'm just talking, Mel said, all right? I mean, I don't have to be drunk to say what I think. I mean, we're all just talking, right? Mel said. He fixed his eyes on her. Sweetie, I'm not criticizing, Terry said. She picked up her glass. I'm not driving home, Mel said. Let me remind you of that. I am not driving. Mel, we love you, Laura said. Mel looked at Laura. He looked at her as if he couldn't place her, as if she was not the woman she was. Love you too, Laura, Mel said. And you, Nick, love you too. You know something, Mel said? You guys are our pals, Mel said. He picked up his glass. He said, I was going to tell you about something. I was going to prove a point about poetry. You see, that poem was written a number of years ago, but things like it are being written right now and ought to make us feel ashamed when we talk like we know what we're talking about, when we talk about poetry and politics. Ms. Spahr.
When we talk about poetry and politics, come on now, Terry said. Don't talk like you're drunk if you're not drunk. Just shut up for once in your life, Mel said very quietly. Will you do me a favor and do that for a minute? So I was saying in Bhopal in like 1984 or so, maybe 15,000 people died, Union Carbide, right? Gas leak all over the place. Terry looked at us and then back at Mel. She seemed anxious. Or maybe that's too strong a word. Mel was handing the bottle around the table. I remember when it happened, Mel said. The workers are cleaning the pipes, and then there's a reaction, an explosion, a leak, whatever. About 30 minutes later, people start suffocating, coughing, their eyes burning, they're vomiting. People trampled, trying to escape. By morning, thousands are dead. There were mass funerals and mass creations. Buffalo, goats, dead animals all over the place, leaves on the trees falling off, all that. Folks, this is an advertisement for the National Not Poetry Society, Terry said. This is your spokesperson, Dr. Melvin R. McGinnis, talking about the meaninglessness of poetry. Terry laughed. Mel, she said, sometimes you're just too much, but I love you, honey, she said. Honey, I love you, Mel said. He leaned across the table. Terry met him halfway. They kissed. Terry's right, Mel said as he settled himself again. I don't need to retell the story. But seriously, this story is about why I think poetry doesn't make anything happen. He drank from his glass. I'll try to keep this short, he said. Years before all this, in West Virginia, the same Union Carbide dug a 3-mile tunnel under a mountain. So the workers hit what's it, a silica deposit? They're not given any mask, even though everyone knew that the miners need masks, but Union Carbide doesn't bother. So surprise, most of the workers are all dead within a year. Okay, so Muriel Rukeyser, now here's your political poet. Muriel Rukeyser writes a poem about it. The poem is fucking beautiful, full of clear language, no need to quote Marx to get the point across. It opens with the poet going down into the valley. She takes the words of the wives of the dead miners and she turns it into this lyric song. There's your sings an impulse to action or whatever. It's impossible not to be moved by this poem. It is a clear, strong poem, a famous poem. People read it and it did nothing. 50 years later, Union Carbide, Bhopal, boom, nothing. Mel stopped talking. Here, he said, let's drink. This cheapo gin the hell up. Then we're going to dinner, right? Terry and I know a new place. That's where we'll go, to this new place we know about. But we're not going until we finish up this cut-rate lousy gin. Terry said, we haven't actually gone there yet, but it looks good from the outside, you know. I like pretty words, end of day, Mel said. If I had to do it all over again, I'd be a lyric poet, you know, right, Terry? Mel said. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I'll tell you mine. But make it pretty. He laughed. He fingered the ice in his glass. Terry knows. Terry could tell you, but let me say this. If I could come back in a different life, a different time and all, you know what? I'd like to come back as Sappho, playing the lyre. She was ugly, but still it's all right, as long as you've got women in song. Mel likes to pretend he'd have Sappho's skills with the ladies, Terry said. Calling them to him with his poetry, Laura said. Or just wants to be a woman, Mel said. Shame on you, Laura said. Terry said, suppose you came back as Homer. Blind bards didn't have it so good in those days, Terry said. Epic poets never had it good, Mel said, writing for the tribe. But I guess even Sappho was a vessel to someone. Isn't that the way it worked? But then everyone is a vessel to someone else. Isn't that right, Terry? But what I like about Sappho, besides her love of women and her ugliness, was that there was no Union Carbide, you know, no unregulated chemical companies. Vassals, Terry said. What? Mel said. Vassals, Terry said. They were called vassals, not vessels. Vassals, vessels, Mel said. What's the fuck's the difference? You knew what I meant anyway, all right. Mel said, so I didn't grow up going to the symphony. I learned my stuff on the shop floor. I'm a poet. Sure, I got my degree, but I know I'm just a mechanic dressed up as a poet. Kids pay their money and then turn in their poems, and I go in and I fuck around and I move a comma or a period, give them back to them. Shit, Mel said. Modesty doesn't become you, Terry said. He's just a humble poet of the people, I said. But sometimes, despite your degrees, you can't see how poetry works. I read somewhere that the prisoners at Attica passed around handwritten copies of that Claude McKay sonnet, If We Must Die, Mel. They even wrote it on the walls. That's terrible, Mel said. That's a terrible example, Nikki. That's a prison riot in which 39 people died. That poem did nothing for them, dead. Some other vessel, Terry said. That's right, Mel said. Some vassal always comes along and shoots everyone, or what the fuck they want to do. Same things we fight over these days, Terry said. Laura said, nothing's changed, men fighting. The color was still high on Laura's cheeks. Her eyes were bright. She brought her glass to her lips. Mel poured himself another drink. He looked at the label closely, as if studying a long row of numbers, and he slowly put the bottle down on the table and he reached for the tonic water. What about political poetry, Mel? Laura said. You didn't finish what you started. Laura was having a hard time lighting her cigarette. Her matches kept going out. The sunshine inside of the room was different now, getting thinner. But the leaves outside the window were still shimmering, and I stared at the pattern they made on the panes and on the Formica counter. They weren't the same patterns, of course. What about politics and poetry, I said. Gets prisoners killed, Terry said. Mel stared at her. Terry said, go on with your story, hon. I was only kidding. Then what happened? Terry, sometimes, Mel said. Please, Mel, Terry said. Don't always be so serious, sweetie. Can't you take a joke? Where's the joke, Mel said. He held his glass and gazed steadily at his wife. What about political poetry? Seriously, Laura said. Mel fastened his eyes on Laura. He said, Laura, if I didn't have Terry, and if I didn't love her so much, and if Nick wasn't my best friend, I'd fall in love with you. I'd write you a sonnet in 14 iambic and rhyming lines. I'd keep the politics out, just 100% poetry. Read it to you in bed if you like. I'd carry you off, honey, he said. Tell your story, Terry said. Then we'll go to that new place, okay? Okay, Mel said. Where was I, he said. He stared at the table, and then he began again. Here's the thing. There are a lot of things I could say that poetry might as well not do. There's no sense in thinking that if we just find the right form, then the politics will be there. If we just make it lyrical, then it will really move people. Or if we just make it experimental, then it will really shake things up. But the content doesn't seem to matter either. Like, it doesn't mean that if we just make it about the local, it will do something locally. Or if we just make it about the workplace, it will help us rise up against capitalism. Or to make it all environmental with long lists of endangered species. Or to write another goddamn Union Carbide poem. I could go on and on listing. It doesn't help to make a series of clever one-liners about capitalism or the war, or to make it all about the domestic or love, or all explicit about the sex everyone's having, or to make it all about the street or the prison and all edgy and with a funky meter or whatever. I mean, the only thing poetry has really done that might matter was in the name of cultural tradition. And tradition only matters when the nation has guns, not just poetry. Because poetry hasn't even been all that convincing to people about the greatness of a nation. Look at all those poets in the Caribbean who make fun of Wordsworth all the time, complaining about having to write poems about daffodils in school, on those islands where daffodils don't even grow. Mel looked around the table and shook his head at what he was going to say. I mean, poetry. It doesn't really do much, and that is what makes it so fucking nothing. We all looked at Mel. You see what I'm saying? Maybe we were a little drunk by then. I know it was hard keeping things in focus. The light was draining out of the room, going back through the window where it had come from. Yet nobody made a move to get up from the table and turn on the overhead light. Listen, Mel said. Let's finish this fucking gin. There's about enough left here for one shooter all around, then let's go eat. Let's go to the new place. He's depressed, Terry said. Mel, why don't you take a pill? Mel shook his head. I've taken everything there is. We all need a pill now and then, I said. Some people are born needing them, Terry said. She was using her finger to rub at something on the table. Then she stopped rubbing. I think I want to read a poem before we eat, Mel said. Is that all right with everybody? I'll read my latest poem, he said. Terry said, after that tirade, what would you read? You've just torn down all the things poetry might do. Honey, you know you don't want to read a poem right now. It'll make you feel worse. I don't want to talk about poetry, Mel said, but I want to read a poem, a real poem. There isn't a day goes by that Mel doesn't say he wishes he'd stayed organizing rather than teach kids how to write poetry, Terry said. For one thing, Terry said, the students only want to talk about themselves. Mel says they just want to write poetry about themselves. If it isn't about them, they don't want to read it. Real poetry doesn't matter to them. They don't read real poetry, Mel said. And if I'm not complaining about having to read their bad poems, then I'm complaining because they haven't turned them in, so I can't read them. Shame on you, Laura said. I was one of those students, you know. They're bad, Mel says. Not you, honey, but the rest of them. Nick knows, don't you, Nikki? Sometimes I think I'll sit down and take my red pen and cross out every line in their precious poems. I'll cross out every line and write a big fat fucking F on the top and then give it back to them. He crossed one leg over the other, and then he put both feet on the floor and leaned forward, elbows on the table, his chin cupped in his hands. Maybe I won't read a poem after all. Maybe it isn't such a hot idea. Maybe we'll just go eat. How does that sound? Sounds fine to me, I said. Eat or not eat or keep drinking. I could head right on out into the sunset. What does that mean, honey, Laura said. It just means what I said, I said. It means I could just keep going, that's all it means. I could eat something myself, Laura said. I don't think I've ever been so hungry in my life. Is there something to nibble on? I'll put out some cheese and crackers, Terry said, but Terry just sat there. She did not get up to get anything. Mel turned his glass over, he spilled it out on the table. Gin's gone, Mel said. Terry said, now what? I could hear my heart beating. I could hear everyone's heart. I could hear the human noise we sat there making. Not one of us moving, not even when the room went dark. And then thanks for having us. It's really great to be here. And then I'm going to read I'm going to read a new piece that's like so new that I was still kind of working on it on the airplane here, and so be gentle with me. And I'm just going to read the first half of it. And the first half, it's kind of obvious what it is, but the second half of it kind of churns and is depressing. So I'm going to read the less depressing part. It's all good, I would say. It's all fucked. And then I would breathe. And then again, it's all good. It's all fucked. Again, breathe. And then it's all good. It's all fucked. Breathe again. I might do this while walking, or while driving in the car, or while lying down before taking a nap. It was non-revolution, or it was me, or it was non-revolution in me. I was unsure what it really was. Maybe it was my thoughts at 1 minute about non-revolution, about the smell of non-revolution, sweat, urine, sage, pot, rotting food, hay, all mixed together. Perhaps about non-revolution's body. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has thought it exceptional, but I'm also just as sure that by the standards of bodies, non-revolutions is fine, but not exceptional. That is the point. That is why non-revolution is called non-revolution. Still, something about non-revolution smell and body had gotten into me. It was thin, except when it was not, and slight, except when it was. And it had this odd patch of hair on its lower back, except when it didn't. And it tasted slightly sour off, except when it was sweet on. At any moment, though, to me, it was like something so excellent I could not get enough of it. I will not go on. I do not need to. You know desire's perceptual alterations as well as me. The way that what might repulse someone not going around saying it's all good, it's all fucked, might become the very thing that makes someone else go around saying it's all good, it's all fucked. I remember saying to non-revolution once, after I said I so want to fuck you right now, I said you smell good to me. These are the mundane things one says in these moments, the moments when one cannot say, you smell like sweat, urine, sage, pot, rotting food, hay, and it's all good to me in this moment. All I could say was, I want to fuck you, and you smell good to me. It's all good, it's all fucked. This is what I like to tell myself, but it's entirely possible it was neither good nor fucked. Maybe it was what it was, just non-revolution. It has revolution as a possibility in its name, but it was modified and thus negated, and as a result, it was possibly neither good nor fucked. Perhaps it could not ever possibly be something that was more, something that was really all good and all fucked without a doubt. Our relation was brief. We spent some time together, a few months maybe, perhaps just a few weeks, depends on how you count it. It happened. It was all fucked, tongue and hands on clit and cock, fist fights too, miscommunication, constant emergencies. It unhappened, text after text, then it happened again, tongue and hands, also injuries, illnesses, more miscommunication, status updates, deep emotional confusion. It was all good, hand in hand, exuberant, giggling desire, then it unhappened again, and still joy, laughter, care, almost psychedelic. A feeling that at moments hinted at rivers running backwards, a flooding, in other words, wind and rain and hatred of capitalism with tongue on tongue. Stuff like that, happening, all fucked, unhappening, all good, and also happening, all good, unhappening, all fucked. And during these moments of happening, of compassion and dedication, giggling exuberance, hands around waist, turning around and pushing into the wall for the deep moment of tongue against tongue, non-revolution was an uneven lover. At moments there, at other moments not. Often non-revolution was off with others, tongue somewhere else in the corner of some other plaza somewhere. This hurt me and it didn't hurt me. I was jealous, I'll admit it. I wanted all the possibility of revolution all the fucking time. I was willing to take it modified and negate it even, but I was not jealous in the convention. I was jealous that I was not there with the exuberance at every moment. I wanted to be. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be there all the time, to be inside every moment, to always be on the lips of non-revolution and whomever non-revolution was touching with their tongue. Whatever parts of bodies of Mexico City, Santiago, El Alto, Madrid, Cairo, Suez, Istanbul. I wanted to be everywhere that non-revolution was. I wanted to be with non-revolution and everyone non-revolution was with. I was so classic, so cliched those months. I joined all the social media, and then I checked all the social media I just joined all the time. All through those months, after I got up each morning, I would check my phone, click its button to light it up to see if anything came through text message while I was sleeping. And then still holding my phone, not yet dressed, uncombed and unbrushed, I would check my email. Check to see if non-revolution was in town and if non-revolution was doing something. Always looking for non-revolution, looking for the pink and white midst of the gases, the burning bus, and the burning car too. Non-revolution wearing a traffic coat hat, throwing rocks at the cops as they retreat, the ice pick and the car tires, the hammer and the window, the chair flying through the air, the paint bomb on the visor. And then after that, if nothing was doing, I would calm down, eat breakfast, realize I had not missed something during the night that I did not want to miss. Then after breakfast, I would one by one go through the social media looking for non-revolution and the status updates and photos and links of friends and friends of friends. I often felt a tingling excitement when I found non-revolution in the feeds of friends of friends. Non-revolution in these moments often looked happy, looked a lover at these moments, a little drunk, a little stimulated too, a little sweaty, flushed. I so wanted to be with non-revolution, I even went to the meetings, wanted to be at the meetings, even though they were often long and it was often cold, and I was often sitting outside on concrete, shivering up from the butt. I wanted to be with. I could not drag myself away. At moments, this desire made sense. I mean, is it not a universal desire to be with at an assembly under a light urban night sky, with a crowd that moves from annoyance at the man who keeps interrupting the assembly to yell, "I love Michael Jackson," to be with this man as we all begin to call out, "I love Michael Jackson," one by one. And then the sound guy puts on Smooth Criminal and everyone then rushes the stage, dancing hard. At other moments, off the pigs, a history so rich, so failed, so sad, and yet still so resistant. They are chanting "No more pigs in our community," which was followed by the hard beat of "Off the pigs." And the pigs are there coming, of course. And non-revolution is texting me. Non-revolution is high above me in a building talking with lawyers about non-revolution who got arrested early or beaten and has been taken to the hospital. Non-revolution can see more police gathering behind the ones to whom we are again chanting "No more pigs in our community." Leave, non-revolution text, leave now. And I'm so caught in the moment I can't leave. I can't stop the heartbeat chanting of "Off the pigs" with Then more police come around the corner and do a National Geographic on some, others rushing in to grab some of us, part of the crowd screaming, part of it trying to pull back those who are getting snatched, part of it running like gazelles towards me. And I run ahead of them, away from them to get out of their way, then suddenly police running towards me in that direction too. And then I am running with the crowd, and between the police, their line is not holding. And I see non-revolution running down the street beside me, and I say, hey, and nothing else as we run together, grabbing each other's hands and run down the street into the bar again. During these weeks, these months, non-revolution was a particularly cloudy and confused mean, like wind and rain and rivers running backwards. I had no control. When I wondered how it could be like this for me at this moment, I blamed it on the art. For all the art I've ever loved has been for whatever it is that non-revolution was suggesting it could possibly be. For the river running backwards, for the wind and the rain. And I am someone who loves art, who has always loved art despite its institutions and its patronage and its nationalisms and its capitalisms. All the art that has had a crowd scene in it in which the crowd has been loved, I have loved. The moment and realist painting of the riot when the perspective switches from the soldier's point of view to that of the crowd, and the people in the crowd are individuals flowing over and out of the space of the painting, and the dog is barking, causing a horse to rear up, and the soldiers in the crowd are at risk, are isolated from the rest of the soldiers, who are off there far in the distance, and one of the rioters in the crowd has a spyglass trained on these soldiers, so they are far off. And the crowd seems to be having fun, even the dog joining in, causing things to tumble. The crowd in this moment, complicated, but still joyous, transitory, momentary, experiencing this one moment of freedom before what we know is to come to them, because we know history, and we know the crowd will not win. Just one day I noticed it, and then I should say I was able to notice this because I had chanted with, and from then on, a different sort of art. All art either with the crowd, our art coming down to that simple divide. When I was off doing non-revolutionary things, such as drinking the whites newly arrived from Croatia with the poets, or eating the thinly sliced cured meats at the bar with the historian of revolution who disdained non-revolution, I kept thinking about wanting to be with instead. At moments I would give myself over. I would just get up and leave the historian of revolution who kept pressing his leg against mine while mocking my attraction to non-revolution, and walk out of the bar and down the street to the plaza to be with. And when I got to with, it was entirely possible, likely even that Smooth Criminal was playing, and a form of dancing that made no sense was going on, messy, chaotic, slightly frightening in its uneven physicality. And very likely at that moment the sky was deep, dark, clear, but with no stars because of the lights on the buildings. They are jostled in that crowd by the felonious and the thieving and the sincere and the educated and the stoned and the constantly shaking and the drunk all the time and the missing teeth and the blood-stained crescendo Annie and even by the socialist with the small yapping dog. At that moment, I would feel I had made a right decision. Were we okay? Like Annie, of course we were not. Would not ever be because we were non-revolution. We were with instead. Thanks. Do we take questions? Why don't we stand here? Tradition.
There's another microphone if you guys want to both have mics.
Questions, comments, suggestions? Oh, way up here, yeah. Of mine? The first thing that I read? Yeah, Occupy Oakland, yeah. So some of that text is, some of it is like collaged text from others, things that were happening over those first 2 months. Yeah, but that's a sort of, if I were to visualize it or want to place it, it's around, yeah, Oscar Grant Plaza in Oakland. Oh, thank you.
I noticed y'all used the photo from J28. People walked out, or like broke out of the cattle.
Yeah.
And also reflecting on that time period and remembering like how excited people were when the in the first thing that you're writing was like momentous, like all over the place, kind of thinking. And then in the second poem, where it's more like the jadedness and like, you know, kind of the fallout afterwards. I just wanted to hear more about like that context, why choosing that photograph, and like, yeah.
I mean,
this is the, if you can't, well, you're not gonna be able to see it anyways, but it's on the interwebs. You'll have to buy it. he's referring to the cover photo, which is a shot from the night of January 28th, 2012, when we sort of burst out of one of the many kettles that the cops were trying to corral us in. And this one actually was, there were three routes of egress that the riot cops had stopped and were actually tear gassed. They're saying you must disperse. They have this dispersal order that they have to give before they arrest you. So they're saying you must disperse, but there's no way to disperse. And then they were throwing tear gas, and then we realized that the fence was not a wall, and shoved the fence down.
But why did you choose this for your cover?
Oh, well, yeah, I know. I'm doing the setup. She gets it. I want her to say the why.
Thanks. I mean, I'm trying to. I think like the piece that we read from the book isn't how the book actually goes in its trajectory. It's like a middle piece, and if it's not obvious, if you haven't read that, it's in which we've kind of inhabited a Raymond Carver story. So we've left like Raymond Carver's characters and Raymond Carver's frame around it, the four people drinking around the table, and we've changed their conversation to make it about poetry. And I think it feels kind of, so that it feels kind of lost. But the last chapter of the book, and the previous chapters have had these two kind of poets in which they keep trying to make art, and they keep failing, and they're lost. And the last chapter has this moment where they kind of like create what the title is referring to, or they references the possibility of this army of lovers, of people coming together. And I think like that moment interested us because it kind of like, even we had written this book before Occupy had happened and way before January 28th. But yet that moment of like a crowd coming together, which felt like it was in that photo and that scene. But I mean, I think that J28 action is a really important, like one of the most important actions that happened around Occupy Oakland, and it hasn't really been kind of talked about that much. But I think that would be also part of it. Like I have a deep fondness for that attempt, that failed action, which has failed so dramatically that it's been hard for people to talk about like what might be worth loving about it. But there's a lot that's worth loving about it.
You can imagine like the number of images, like, well, we don't want just an image of like people marching with placards or something. We don't want something where it's like cops, like over-romanticized cops battling or whatever. But I like this image because you can't tell if they're running from or running towards, right? And it's both, right? And I like that idea of a suggestion of what that might mean. What is that moment when you're sort of, both escaping from and running towards? And I'm fascinated by images of fences because they are, unlike walls, they are something that they're used to block property, right? And no trespassing, but you can see through them. So it's like here, it's like a window, right? Which is why one way of thinking about smashing windows, right, is that it's actually going to taunt you and be like, here's this open space, and the image here is, it's not just escaping the kettle, but it's going into this open area that Occupy Oakland had briefly occupied. We'd been kicked out of the Oscar Grant Plaza twice, then there was a takedown of the fences there and a brief setup of the camp in this other site. And so this idea of not just breaking through the fence to escape, but to open up these possibilities that are fenced off. I hadn't really thought about it like that.
I have a question for Juliana. In your piece that you wrote, the last piece you read, you mentioned non-revolution a lot. I was just wondering what it meant to you, the significance of it.
Well, half the time it's capitalized and half the time it's not, which you can't hear in some way. But so I was trying to find a term for something that I don't know. I toyed with using some sort of like non-insurrection was like the other term, and I think I was just trying to find a term for like these moments that happen in which they're very clearly not going to overthrow society or not going to change society. Like they have certain limitations around them, and yet I was interested in them in that way. And then it just keeps, I mean, I think because it's both using it as a moment of standing in for like a personified lover, in which it turns into the capitalized version, and then at other moments for the actual kind of like a movement that is a non-revolutionary movement that alludes to, that alludes to revolution, or might have a revolutionary desire or aspiration that's going to be unable to meet. Is why it feels like it shows up so much in there, because it's doing double duty. Like if I'd used Sam, for instance, or Jane, it would have like broken it up a little, but.
So, I'm gonna try it. I was thinking about when writing something, a genre can like, the context of what you're writing can become the genre of what you're writing. And I was thinking about this also in relation to words, and how like words can dissolve into the context of what you're writing. I'm trying to think of how to say this, but I was wondering if you could define, this is kind of a hard question, but if you could define cynicism in your writing, and what does like self-reflexive witticisms within this greater attempt to like explore memories and experiences of attempts of revolution, what do those accomplish, and how does that connect with this contextual definition of cynicism? And
Don't keep going.
Let's tackle that one first. Cynicism.
You're the cynic.
No, she's not. My unfinished dissertation was on the question of cynicism and how it shows up in culture, more in the 90s than today. Well, if we start more with what I think is the second half of your question, around, or at least that thing of what work does it do when you sort of have the kind of self-mockery tone that shows up in different places in the book. Maybe that's, I think that there's a line between, it's just finding a line that's not, like cynicism, disillusionment, pessimism, sort of dismissivism, if that's a word, which are these affective states that one can get into, from the sidelines. Oh, this will never work, you stupid, hippies. Why bother? Like you're obviously, cops will beat you. Like I don't have to do anything because I know better than you. To going through the ringer, coming out the other side, and just feeling defeated, right? Why isn't revolution texting me back, right? Which can lead to a cynicism, right? Like just fuck it, right? There's no hope or whatever. And how to battle that without going to the other extreme, which is either whatever you want to call it, over romanticization, naivete, sort of self-celebration of like we fought the man, and these sort of things. And again, we were writing this before 2011, but even in that nexus of sort of thinking about how to be a political poet or artist citizen is, I think, thinking a lot about how to work through and past the kind of cynicism that really we're taught to, consciously or not, actually live through, right? We're trained as Americans to, it's not named cynicism, it's called, freedom or choice or what, these sort of things of like, you can have, don't be cynical, you can have one of a million different kinds of soft drinks, right? You have an incredible range of choices, right? And that actually is an incredible incredible mode of cynicism, which, because it says as long, it implies as long as you stay within this, right? So I don't know, that's a broad sort of just me thinking aloud about how to find a way in the writing to balance that and not tip over, just like one has to do, and you have to, get out of bed and feel cynical about well, I have to do this, or I should do this, even though I don't think it will matter, right? And how not to drown in that. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, is it okay if I finish?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I think that part of it was thinking about the relationship of cynicism, and not just from the sidelines, but post-experience, and also like, what's the relationship? You don't have to answer this, but this is just thoughts that are coming from these. What's the relationship between cynicism and nostalgia, and how do they position each other? And when thinking about revolutions or history of revolutions, how many years or decades or perhaps centuries does it take to call something a revolutionary history, or to call something a revolution, or to think of something as a non-revolution? Because a lot of things happen and fail in the course or process of revolution, and who's to say that revolution is like cognition, something that is completed and then something new happens? It could be, it's like an unveiling or a process.
I mean, we do have moments where we know that there's the French Revolution, right? Where we can name it, or we can even name it by a day or something.
Well, it's taken enough time that it became history, but it took it took a lot of time. I'm sure there's lots of failed things with it.
I think you're getting at a really crucial question that I'm not sure that there's an answer for, which is like, there's that moment where everyone keeps looking at what's happening in Greece and being like, Greece keeps coming and going and coming and going, and like, what is that going to do? And then we look at something like Egypt, and it's like, oh, it happened, and then something else has happened now. In some way. I keep thinking of your question about that question Magid asked us when we were just in Seattle. He's a poet from Egypt, and he has, the question was kind of like, you guys, what was it? A comment, yeah. It was kind of like, it's not heroic. Was that kind of what it was? Or like you don't seem very hopeful.
Making revolution seem futile in your country?
I think that might have been like his question was like, what does it mean that actually I don't feel like you're leading me into revolution in some way? And I'm not sure. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's something that we often have conversations about. Like, what's the role of like, should the representational be more heroic? Is it too heroic? What happens when it's too heroic? What happens when it's not heroic enough? Like, is that also a disservice? And I don't really know whether we were kind of talking about that in that class. I'm not sure I have the answers yet to that, although I keep trying to kind of like try to think about it. But.
I think that also the question of nostalgia is really interesting to me, because nostalgia can be a form of cynicism, right? It's like, I can't expect anything better, so I'm going to harp on how great it was then, right? Nostalgia often is a symptom of a kind of hopelessness. And so, but at the same time, I used to have this hot relationship with this cat named, Unrevolution, like, I can get turned on by thinking of, like, whatever, I don't know. It's your story, I don't know. Sometimes nostalgia can reanimate affective states, if I maybe use less dirty words, that can have a purpose, which is why one goes back and reads poetry from those moments, even if sort of, God, I would never write it so heroically about my moment. That's too, like, who am I to do that? That's like, oh my gosh, I love these, classic, heroic revolutionary poems from, a distance away. Yeah, it's like someone else's nostalgia. It can be inspiring.
I guess thinking back on that last question and your response, just like, does the mere expression that cynicism or that confusion about revolution or whatever given subject, figuring that within the writing, does that immediately foreclose what you're discussing or what you're talking about? And I guess I also think maybe a way to clear that around that is within whatever established subjectivity of the writing, your somewhat autobiographical quality of it, because the two of you are in it, all of a sudden your cynicism or whatever you can call it, I guess, questionable, for example. I don't know if that's a question I just asked.
Maybe. I think it has to be, that's the risk. You have to put it all in. to get through it. Gross generalization, right? But, and you know, we've all read things where you just smell, your bullshit detector's like, that just seems too easy, right? And not that, you know, oh, I want to see everyone's struggle in everyone's home, but I think because these kinds of questions today around the sort of, some people say like after the crest of certain kinds of brief eruptions of possibility, let's say in the States around Occupy, what, you know, the what next, and how many people are feeling, you know, I mean, dealing with like very real consequences, you know, in terms of state repression or just run down and depressed and, you know, all these sort of things. I mean, those are real things that, you know, that going back to reading revolutionary theory there's not a lot in the literature that's helpful for, like, you know, which is why I have with comrades who are like, I'm really thinking a lot about, you know, different modalities of thinking through trauma as a way of maybe thinking about affective states in, you know, in these moments, the lulls or the beatdown, right? And that's something that one has to work through, and all those different kinds of ways of thinking about that I think art can do, you know, or it's a place that art is particularly well equipped to do, right? Because it's messy, and art can make that in its best way. That mess can be, I mean, investigated, represented, but also like it can have a life force to it. It can be animated in a way that, you know, other forms can't do.
It reminds me of Mary Jane's first part of her question about context becoming genre, and sort of genres of protest, or I don't know, there's something about the unknownness of the next genre of resistance and the unknownness of the genre of the book. And
yeah, I mean, my only thought there that I'm having is that one of the reasons why I wanted to, in that piece, to put it as the lover, is that I wanted to still have the possibility. I didn't want to only write the ennui. I didn't want to only write the dissolution, finally, because it felt like the lover part is very important. And in part, like, that was like a reply to, like, there's a lot of, like, poets at the time that had very robust social lives, and that were finding, that would say things like, I don't want to go to the protest, I want to go socialize in some way. And I was very interested in the kind of the intense socialization, the intense emotions that were happening around the protest at that moment. So, I mean, I feel like I'm trying to think with it, but I'm not sure. Like, I think if I didn't present it as something that had somewhat failed, that would be delusional to not kind of acknowledge that at the same time. And the only way to kind of move to the next moment would be to be like, oh, there's moments where this happens, and we have to think about maybe how to protect those moments at the same time. But I don't want to only dwell on I wouldn't want to only dwell on the failure or something. There's you and then you.
I'm here with a bunch of people from Reading Materials, which is a sustainable design program. And we were intrigued by BARGE and the idea of ecological aesthetics, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of sustainability and visual arts, and, environmental arts. Just wondering what you might have to say about BARGE.
Sure. Well, BARGE is it's a Bay Area research group in Enviro-aesthetics. It's kind of made it up. It's a sort of, you know, like you make up a fake thing so that it will become real. I guess maybe that's just what life is, but I mean, it became a container for some work I was doing that was often around both site-specific work that drew on everything from environmentalist discourse and anti-gentrification movements in the Bay Area, militarized landscapes like the former military bases in the Bay Area, but also on the aesthetics of the tour, like when you go to a place and you get a tour, and which has which is a genre, right? And so like getting back to the context changes the genre. And I was really interested, but I would do these things, and they often were just like field trips, like, hey, who wants to go check out this wackadoodle place, and I'll do a little bit of research and be your fake tour guide or detour. And then, you know, within a year, I'm like get asked to do this thing, and I'm walking down Market Street in San Francisco, which is a lot of tourists there, and I was fascinated by this moment where you go, I'm sorry, you're my tour group, right? And I'm walking backwards through a public area going like this and talking, and people will just be like, oh, that guy knows what he's talking about. Let's see what he has to say. And like tourists just like come right in, you know, and like anything comes out. I mean, you know, my friends would know, like they know where I go from performance art to bullshit art. But you know, I mean, you can point, if you're at point, especially if you're, you know, cocky sounding white male, and you point at something and say with some confidence, this happened here, it shapes the way you see the end of my finger, right? And so it's really interesting in that as a kind of enviro-aesthetics. It's not simply about, you know, an object in space or design per se in the present, but also how traces of history in a place get, especially when they're erased, radical or you know, marginalized histories, how they can be sort of reanimated in the spatial landscape, the lived everyday landscape through whatever, narrative or performance or things like that. And so that work it's off and on work depending on what projects I'm doing, and it's involved a lot more collaborators over time. That's kind of, there's a lot about thinking a lot about the urban landscape. So like thinking about, I did a project on, what was it called, like sort of .com landscapes during the late 90s, the first boom of the .com industry down there, and thinking about how would you read San Francisco as a .com landscape, sort of against the discourse of it being this kind of immaterial, invisible thing that's out in the web somewhere, but actually it brutally affects the landscape of San Francisco gentrification, but also you see it in design. So like billboard design would change. And I did a whole thing on like billboards as like sort of thought balloons of a city, right? And furniture design, like all these sort of ways in which the discourse. So it's a long-winded answer, but it's kind of a way to put a lot of those questions that I have out into space and moving through, rather than just sort of writing about.
I feel like also, like when you said enviro-aesthetics from his term, I was also thinking there's been a huge debate in poetry about the difference between nature poetry and an eco-poetry, in which in nature poetry, which is, again, like that Mary Oliver poem is often used as a classic example. Like I saw what's the animal that she sees?
Goose.
The geese fly over her, and she has this epiphany, as opposed to kind of like one that's more systemic and that shows the environmental degradation. And that's kind of a big debate in poetry, because poetry has a lot of a really close relationship to representations of nature. And there's been this kind of scene, it goes back to your genre thing. There's been the development of a kind of new turns of genre or forms of like how do you represent things more systemically in a time of environmental crisis, some of which is utterly failing, and at other moments there seems to be some kind of interesting work that's coming out of it.
Well, you have, I mean, it's your quote, right, where it's something like this about Hawaiian nature poetry that you always, the poem will always, what is it, like have the pretty bird in it, but it'll never have the bulldozer right behind there, because you can't see the scene without the logic of the bulldozer, right, that creates those scenes. So I think that's a way of thinking. So it's not just like, we need more poems about acid rain or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, the dialectics of those.
So Red, sure. You, yes.
Okay, I wanted to talk just about, you mentioned the word heroic. And
Heroic?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I was thinking sort of about the problem of representing revolutions, and a different lecture that goes on in here on Monday nights called Critical and Cultural Theory. We read something by Francis Fanon where he talks a little bit about the storytellers during the Algerian Revolution and how they became much more relevant when old forms and archetypes were brought more into the modern context. So, and I was sort of wondering about what you think the relationship between storytellers and poets is, and how your representation of revolution can be, like what the role of heroics is in that. And how to represent the revolution in this time as a poet.
I don't know. I mean, the Fanon. we, again, like we talked some about this there's like the anti-colonial moments have a particular interest in the arts for very interesting reasons. That feels really, really important, and I would be really hesitant to include my work in that, or to make kind of similar claims because it's such a different situation in the United States, finally. But the only thing that I could possibly add is, like, I personally, sometimes the heroic stuff makes me nervous. And I'm trying to think about why it's making me nervous and if that's a legitimate nervousness. Because I actually think that there's often these moments where you can have emotional reactions that have been imposed on you by the state. And you need to think through them. You need to think about why, like, where have I gotten this kind of, like, where have I gotten a resistance to a heroicism? And why do I why do I keep wanting to back away from it? But I don't really, do you have any?
No, I think similarly. I'm also very interested in those traditions, but wary in the way they might show up in a context like the States, and but it's also interesting to think about because it's like, in the visual arts world, in other sort of art forms, it's just like you don't see moments of, there's not even like that many images of sort of revolutionary heroism that one could dismiss as being, oh, that's so too heroic. It's just, there's none, right? And I can't think of any, like once in a while there'll be a French movie that comes out that's about 1968, right? And about, like, there's a menage a trois happening while the streets are burning, right? It's like sort of nostalgic yet cynical at the same time, right?
Sexy.
Yeah. So, like Milan Kundera is jacking off in a corner or whatever. I didn't have subtitles. But yeah, there's not, so it might be that's the thing. If there's this wariness that might be imposed in the culture that it might be interesting to push back up against, right? But, it's like, it's hard for me too as a, like, straight white male guy in Oakland to be like, I'm going to write this heroic poem, like, I was there in Oakland, fist in the sky, with you brother and you sister when, I can get on a plane and come up here. And a lot of people in Oakland can't. So it's tricky, right? It's tricky. But I think it's an interesting tradition, or we might mean different things by the heroic, but it's an interesting modality or tone to think about, or look back and trace through different relationships between art and revolutionary moments.
And then you up there after him.
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow up on exactly what you're saying. So first of all, thank you both very much. It's really wonderful reading. I wanted to ask about, seeing as your work seems to be centering around aesthetics and political engagement and the kind of how one might negotiate that. I was sort of interested in knowing what kind of aesthetic theory or theorists you're finding yourself in dialogue with or finding interesting at the moment.
Say it, Jordan.
Perhaps.
It's interesting.
I reply, because I always feel like there's a standoff between Adorno and
right. That's her. That was our game. That's how we wrote this. No, I'm Adorno. No, you're Adorno. I've been reading a lot. Well, it's interesting because in the Bay, there's a lot. It feels like there's a lot of reading groups and little symposia and things that are going on that are often around like sort of rediscovery and rethinking about sort of 70s era radical Marxist feminists, and autonomy movements, and so a lot of political theory that isn't necessarily about the aesthetic, but clearly in dialogue. I feel like there's a lot of reading groups that are reading just sort of revolutionary history and theory, and so I don't. If there's an Adorno reading group going on among the poets, I'm not on that list, right? So which is just interesting. I mean, part of this is just like our little milieu and like what, you know, is it a trend or whatever, but like as a way of sort of being like, what are people thinking about? You know, like, oh, well, what's showing up in the, you know, who's giving talks at the free school and what's those kinds of things. I've been doing a lot of reading on theater, and there's some really interesting, and some on performance, including like reenactment, which is a sort of new formation, or I mean, and thinking about arts reenactments in theater and performance and its relationship to radical politics. And there's this amazing, I'm not going to remember it correctly, but like 1 year after the Bolshevik Revolution, maybe 2, there's a giant reenactment of the storming of the Winter Palace that's filmed. So, I mean, you have to imagine, you're getting people who did it themselves, right? But like thousands of people, but you're staging it for a camera, but you're also staging it, it's like, you know, like the 4th of July, right? So we're going to actually reenact. So I'm interested in a lot of that, and playwrights like Dario Fo, the Italian playwright, and others who sort of saw the, you know, the debates around theater. But I'm not, I don't know, I just can't, there's only so much I can read of like, you know, capital T theory. I'm more like I'm just reading, these days I'm reading plays and Latin American novels, I think, and that the unseen.
The other book that's felt really crucial to me is that Peter Weiss, Aesthetics of Revolution, which has it in the title.
Aesthetics of Resistance.
Aesthetics of Resistance, yeah. I mean, that book is, I think, amazing. I mean, we only have 1 volume of it in English. It keeps being this rumor that we'll get the other 2, which I hope happens before I die.
It's a novel.
It's a novel, but yeah,
it's a program.
Yeah, it's just really, been really.
How do you go about setting up your expression of what you want to write about, and how do you come up with form of it? It seems like you have a lot of thoughts and ideas with your own plane, and it comes out and you're writing very smooth.
Well, that was many drafts, if nothing else. But I mean, I work backwards to how most people say they work. You know, there's that old, like, poets are supposed to have the emotion recollected and tranquility. Like, I often will research a lot and think a lot before I actually write something. Well, I even have whole notebooks of things. I'll go read books. I'll decide what I'm going to write. But I know a lot of people do the opposite. I don't know.
I tend to, I chew on stuff a lot. I walk around, like I literally grind my teeth to different rhythms when I'm just walking around or driving. I mean, not necessarily consciously. And so and again, there's research, but you know, going on a walk to a place over and over and, you know, waiting. And then, but yeah, things will sort of like be, you know, work out. Then like, there's just hope, or with practice of faith, I don't like the word faith, but a sense that the method, that something will spill out, and then you shape and forge and shape and forge. I write more in verse, probably than you do. But we're always also juggling several projects, so it might be, you know. But I mean, I'm you know, Post-it notes, calling my voicemail, leave myself like 3 words, hoping that later that will remind me of something.
I mean, I text myself all the time stuff.
Yeah. Looking sexy, looking good.
We have 1 more? Is that
well, maybe we could do, well, he had his hand up for a while.
Okay.
Well, this kind of goes back to what Jane was saying also about the cynicism and romanticism, but can you speak to the importance of making sense of failure without becoming jaded?
Making sense of failure without becoming jaded. Yes, absolutely. There's a line in there, a very brief line that we appropriated from the artist William Pope L. He says, futility is the magic. Now, futility is not the same as failure, right? But futility is the magic. And I think, which I really like, and I think, well, I tried to articulate this yesterday in Eric's class, with this idea that through, not that you go out, let's go out and fail, but you hopefully learn, I mean, whatever, not just you learn lessons, but you learn new questions. Oh, maybe not just we didn't do X, Y, and Z right, so next time we'll do X, Y, and Z better, but maybe those were we were asking the wrong questions, right? And likewise with writing or art, right? Or it simply could be like, I wrote a book, and I don't know whether it failed or not, but like I have new questions now, so or I want to write the response to the first book rather than like I want to make it better or you know, and I mean there are all those, you know, the Beckett quote of fail better and you know, must go on, can't go on, must go on. But you know, I mean it's I don't know, I mean she's never written anything that's failed, so I deal with it all the time. Yeah, you know, I mean, it's so hard not to say a cliche like dust yourself off, and you know. But yeah, I think there's something to be gained from it by going through it, rather than being like, oh, that failed, but I'm okay. I'll try a different thing or try again. It's like, well, what and why?
Were you asking about writing or political failure?
Just in general. I mean,
just in general.
The ideas that you guys are talking about are really big, and there's a lot of area for the idea of dismissiveness or defeated like ideals to come in. So like, in that, like, how do you get up out of bed talking morning and that kind of shit?
Well, I fail getting out of bed. So I fail out of bed. Well, the interesting thing about the Occupy moment is, like, we talked a little bit about this, but the refusal to make demands. So how can you say you failed, right? It's not like we were like, well, we said we were going to overthrow the state, and we did. Damn, we failed. You know, I mean, obviously, it was a beautiful disaster in many ways, but I mean, I think that the rhetoric around, whereas the anti-war movement, which I was involved in, I mean, the most recent anti-war movement in the 2000s, you knew going in it was well, most people knew it was going to fail, and it was doomed to failure, and that played out in people's experiences in that movement, where you show up at a march and it's like, yeah, another march, okay, you know, like you felt like out of like sort of like no war or whatever, right? It becomes tedious. That's a different problem. We've had, well, you had your hand up, and yeah, let's go here, then we'll see. Oh, we have to get you out of here. Who's in charge?
Yeah, I'd really love to hear you guys talk about your collaborative process.
We talk a lot, and we walked a lot, and then we would have ideas, and we would try. Sometimes one person would do it, and then the other person would, or one person would be like, "I'll take that on, I'll do that." But I mean, there was a lot of work that didn't make it in. That got cut. We did a lot of writing. It felt like a really long time, although I actually don't think it was probably that long of a time finally. But it felt like we worked on it for quite some time. But like you know, like the pieces still feel to me like they have an author behind them, and then like the other person would enter in and begin to edit. And then we did some final last edits at the end, and so it felt some rearranging, and that felt less. So some of that's disappeared, I think, as we did some of that. Like things got recombined in different ways at that moment. But I mean, if there's anything that we kind of were talking about that yesterday again, if there's anything that I've learned, it's like that I've learned that it feels like there's no right way to do it, or you know, or maybe there's only wrong ways, or something like that. Like there's I kind of compulsively collaborate because I find it so incredibly helpful, and it's kind of different with every process. And then I'm trying to like just give up the idea that like there's a one way to do it that's better or fairer in some way, and which has also meant like abandoning like a lot of these ideas of like who owns the idea or who the authorship is or what it means to kind of like give some of your research over to the other people that you're writing with, and which feels good to me. Like that feels productive and kind of even more representative to how the brain works, in which nothing is really yours anyway. Finally.
Although I would to play devil's advocate, I was at this gathering of artist collectives. I don't know, last year before, and there were some that had been working together 10, 15 years, and there was really painful discussions around a lot of invisible labor, almost always done by women, that doesn't get recognized. And so the unequal division of labor, and these are primarily visual artist collectives, but who's writing the grants, who's doing all that sort of stuff. But there's less. Well, Juliana probably did more work, but I will always acknowledge it. But there's like 5 pieces of the book. The other thing I was going to add, there's 5 pieces of the book, and there are probably on average 50 drafts of each piece, I'd say. Even if some are very minor changes. But it's a lot of that. But I mean, if you're building a relationship with somebody, you're going to have more than 15 arguments, right? Or whatever. Just you real quick, and then
yeah, that was kind of like where my question started, and then the other part of my question then was about like you talked about kind of some of the things in your poetry about like what art can't do, and then so like maybe talking about how as a collective you can begin to do some of those things that maybe like with 2 people or more of a collective you can start to do things, some of those things that art can't do by being collaborative. Do you think about that?
Well, I mean, part of how the collaboration started, at least my memory is, we start with, well, we don't know what we want to do, but we know what we don't want to do, right? And that gets kind of burlesque at different places in the book. But we don't want to do that kind of thing. We don't want to do that, not because it's bad, but we've done that, or we feel that we know the limits, or we know the questions that will come up again and again. And so that is also that sort of like the context changes the genre. It's like, so it's not like, oh, so we'll definitely let's write some stories, right? We didn't set out to do that either. So I think that, but again, it'd be much harder, I think, to do that individually. For everyone else, everyone by themselves left, if you're like, everyone go home and then by yourself invent a new form, it's very different than, but like if you're working and the bigger the group, the more you have to sort of figure out and compromise and change. And there's a lot more unpredictability that then, if you're open to that, something can come out of that you wouldn't have expected. I mean, ideally.
Thank you.
Perfect.